few things before I actually get started. Hi, I'm Ed Marczak. Just so you don't have to scroll things down super fast while I'm talking, and some slides are fairly packed, I have prepared a handout, a PDF, that contains pretty much every link and every reference and everything in this presentation. So you can fetch it at that URL. It's good for right now. It's good for future reference. The other thing I want to do very clearly is thank Rusty and Justin and everyone involved in putting this conference together, because it's a huge undertaking. And as someone who puts together a conference myself, I know that you have to play host and you don't get to sit around and watch the sessions and get to do things like an attendee. So big round of applause for them. Thanks very much, Rusty and Justin and everyone. But of course, the big question is, why are we all here? Not in the metaphorical sense, but this specific session. I don't know who I'm competing with, but you could have went to 3 or 4 other sessions, but you chose this one. Anyone care to tell me why they showed up here instead of some other session? Anyone?
Creative title.
Creative title. All right, well that's good to, that's personally bolstering. Yeah.
Logs are important, but they scare the devil out of me.
Okay, good. Well, that's the right reason, I think. So logs are a sort of piece of the puzzle, and the bigger puzzle is monitoring and understanding what's going on a single machine or a fleet of machines.
That URL.
Sure. Look, I can hit the back arrow. There you go. For anyone who needs it. But, so logs are part of a much bigger puzzle, which is just understanding what's going on a machine, on a fleet of machines. Sometimes there are better solutions. If your users are complaining, or particular users complaining about slow file copy, maybe you should be using IOStat or NetStat, or doing packet captures if that file transfer is going over a network. But usually logs are useful in conjunction with all that. And the reality is we're doing, in general, a fairly poor job of this holistic view. And why do we need to understand logs? Because we work with machines that run software. Software developers are the devout, right? They believe their software has no bugs, and they believe their software runs on machines that have no network latency, and they believe machines never have hardware issues, right? But we're in IT. We have to be the skeptics. We know all software is buggy. We know everything fails, usually in the worst possible order at the worst possible time. And we know that physics applies. Inside the machine, you can't break the speed of light just because it's inside the machine, right? So we're the slightly more skeptical bunch, and we need data to prove when things go off the rails, what's going off the rails. So who needs to understand this? Everyone, every admin, flat out, without question, every admin needs to know how to read logs. And again, I don't think we're doing a great job of this. I have people who contact me personally, or I see questions on mailing lists where they say, I have this problem, it's X, Y, and Z, and myself or someone else will answer them and say, well, have you looked at the logs? What do the logs say about, what's going on? And their reply comes back, I don't know how to read logs, or I'm not a terminal person. Both are sort of bad excuses for an admin, but when I hear this, I hear, I hate text. And, but I can empathize, right? I can empathize a little bit with this because we grew up in the world of Macintosh, right? And when you're used to this, looking then at something like this can be a little daunting, right? But it's really easy once you break it down. Anyone use Twitter? Anyone use Twitter? Show of hands. All right, most of you, right? Reading this is no different than reading this. You can think of logs as your computer's personal Twitter stream, right? I asked my good friend David Byrne, Professor David Byrne, to come down here and ask a question. He wasn't able to make it, so he prepared this video. Oh, no, wrong, giving this up. This, unlike the video I opened with, this is how logs are actually used.
Captain's log, supplemental entry. 2 drops of cordrazine can save a man's life. 100 times that amount has just accidentally been pumped into Dr. McCoy's body. And in a strange, wild frenzy, he has fled the ship's bridge. All connecting decks have been placed on alert. We have no way of knowing if the madness is permanent or temporary, or in what direction it will drive McCoy.
Well, now we know what direction it'll drive McCoy. But, like most Star Trek episodes, starts out with the captain saying, "Captain's log, blah, 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 blah." So, when we're talking about computer logs, we're not talking about these logs. We're talking about these logs. We're talking about a journal, a record of events. Again, that means someone wrote it, and it's all text. It's nothing to be scared about. It is human readable. That's the whole idea behind these logs. It's machine parsable too, but in general, it's people that go back and read these logs, just like the ship's log or an airplane's black box recorder. It's a journal of events. It's a journal of things that have happened. Logs don't quite predict the future, right? It's only after something runs that it can write something into the logs. And just like a ship's log, you know, divers go down and they find a sunken ship, and maybe there's a captain's journal, and you can go through it and you can find the captain writing about, you know, all these trips that they went on, and then eventually it gets to the part where, oh, there's a storm closing in and we're sailing in rocky waters, and now you can surmise the rest because this ship is sitting at the bottom of the ocean. We want to do the same thing with computers, right? As humans, we need some tools to parse all of this text, like grep, sed, awk, anything that'll do regex expressions. So let's take a look at a typical entry in a log file. And we're going to just break this down piece by piece. This is sort of a de facto standard log line that you might find in a log entry. And what does it contain? Well, this first piece is the timestamp. It tells you when this was written into the log. This particular entry was written on March 9th at 8:32 and 37 seconds. This should also point out to you the fact that you want your machines to be syncing to a time server so they have realistic time on them. And that goes for anything that you're getting logs from, whether that's a router or other device, your airport base stations, etc. The next thing in this log entry is the host name. One little caveat on OS 10 is that it writes the computer's short name into the record. If any of you are Unix admins, you know that it usually writes the fully qualified domain name. In smaller environments, this isn't a big deal. In larger environments where you might have machine name collisions, this becomes a bit of a pain because you could have 10 different machines named the same thing. The next thing in this log entry is the process name and the process ID in brackets. So this log entry was written by config-d, and it was process ID 15 at the time. And finally, the important thing is the message that it is trying to tell you. And in this case, at 8:32 and 37 seconds on March 9th, config-d mentioned network configuration changed. That's it, not too tough, right? That probably half of you can leave the room now. That probably clears up the bulk of confusion, right? So that's all that is contained in that one line. And you will find this over and over and over again, a timestamp, a host name, a process, and the message. Now, that's not to say every message is purely easy to understand. Log messages are written by the developers of the software. And sometimes they can be somewhat cryptic, but Google is definitely your friend there. If you're seeing a log message and have some complaint about it, very likely other people do as well. Depending on the developer, you can report this log line and say, what does this entry in our log mean? And hopefully they can tell you. I mentioned the individual contents of a log file. Where do you find these log files? Traditionally, on other Unix and Unix-like systems, you'll find them in var log. Apple adds two other locations that are important to look at. One is /library/logs, and the other is in a user's home directory under library logs. So, now an appearance from Professor David Byrne.
You may ask yourself, well, how did I get here?
That's right, thank you, David. How did I get here? If you are an entry in a log file, how did you get there? Well, there's really only two ways that an entry gets into a log file. Direct file access, just a direct write into a file, or via syslog. So let's talk about directly writing into a file. Nothing fancy. You can open a file stream, shove it into a text file, close it. If you're using the shell, you can just echo a string, redirect it into a log file, in this case, logs myapp.log, and that's it. So in this case, we're putting 3 entries into this text file, starting application, something happened, and ending application. And that's a log. No big deal, right? If we want to get a little fancier, we can do some variable substitution and put in the date and the process name. We can even assign those things, which if you're writing something larger in a shell script, you can even make a function out of that. So you're always getting the same benefit of tagging on the date and the app name into your log file. Doing this, just writing log files directly into a log, popular, nothing wrong with it. It's a perfectly cromulent way to write logs. Apache does this. Since this is sort of Greg Nagel love fest, Monkey does this. Monkey's a good example, right? It just, when it needs to write a log message into, what is it, library, logs, managed something or other, just opens a file stream, writes the log message. When it's done, closes it. You have a log. Voila. The other way to deal with logs is using syslog, the system logging facility. It listens to a network port or a network socket for log messages. It's defined in RFC 5424. Just thought I'd mention that. Not that will increase your understanding of this. Again, syslog writes out log messages that are just text files. No big deal. Anyone know where syslog came from? What project? Who created it? Anyone? SendMail. The SendMail project had a bunch of different processes that all run at the same time and all need to be doing some logging. So they thought, well, we should have a centralized logging facility. And syslog was born, and other people saw that this had some value and was useful, so they adopted it. And syslog has become a wildly successful standard. As I mentioned, syslog will listen on a network port. If you go look at Etsy services, I will never past this slide ever again mention reliable syslog service. It was an experimental thing that never went anywhere, but I included it for completeness. Syslog listens to UDP port 514 by default. Syslog brings a lot more to the table than simply writing a message into a log file. It can categorize messages by facility and severity, and I'll give you some examples. Facility determines who sent the message, and the standard facilities are notice, authpriv, remote auth, FTP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Kernel, and you can see mail gets a special mention, of course, since it came from a mail project. Severity, which is also known as the priority, has a different set of ranges, all the way from debug, which is the most verbose method of logging. Pretty much anything that writes logs at a debug level is just going to flood you with information, all the way up through emergency, which is shut up unless the machine's on fire. That's the emergency level of logging, which it's very rare to see anything log at emergency level. So, give a few quick examples how to use syslog. If you are a shell person, there is a built-in command line utility called logger. If you type logger and send it a string, it will send it through syslog and put it in your system log. You can try that now. It's really exciting. Logger has a few flags you can use. Logger -i will also include the process ID, and logger -p will also send along a priority, a facility and priority, if you care to encode it that way. If you are an Objective-C person, you are likely already familiar with the nslog function. Again, you send it a string and you can do variable substitution. That just stuffs it in the console log. If you are a Python person, you'll know that Python is a little bit more involved, shall we say. This is in the handout. You don't need to scroll it down if you want a recipe on how to use this. The important thing to note is that Python includes a logging module and a logging handlers module. And on OS X, you need to very specifically tell it to grab the PID of syslog and send to syslog. If you are a Ruby person, a little bit easier, but again, the thing to remember is that there is a syslog module that you can require and include in your programs to send messages to syslog. I've mentioned these specific languages. Any language you pick up, Perl or Go or Java, is absolutely going to have a way to send messages to syslog. AppleScript? I don't know. That one I don't know about. Anyone? Sending messages to syslog via AppleScript? No.
Do shell scripts.
Yeah. Yuck.
It has its own log command.
Huh.
Well, you can do Objective-C with Apple.
Yeah. All right. There's some hacky ways. All right. As I mentioned, syslog brings a lot more to the table for you than simply writing a message into a file via direct write. And this is all configured via the etc syslog.conf file. And what this does is it describes to syslog how to route messages to files. And it does that based on their facility and severity. So if you were to look in var log for log files, you'll see a whole host of these log files. And you start looking through them, you'll pick some different ones out, like install log or kernel log or system log. Well, again, how do messages know to go into those particular logs? Again, it's syslog.conf. And if you look at syslog.conf, you'll see all this stuff that looks a little confusing, but we can break it down for you. Generically, a line in syslog.conf is a facility and priority, and if it matches, the log file to send that to. So here are some examples from the stock etc syslog.conf that is on every one of your Macs right now. ftp.asterisk goes into varlog ftp.log. This is a good example because the facility is FTP, but it shows that you can wildcard the priority. So a message comes in, if it's facility FTP, any priority, send it to ftp.log. lpr.info goes to varlog lpr.log. And again, LPR, very specifically, only if it's the info priority do we send this message into this log. This is a good example. auth.info, semicolon, authpriv.asterisk. This shows that you can match multiple facilities and priorities and send them to the same log file. This is a good example because it shows you can use the wildcard not only on the priority, but the facility as well. So this rule is saying any priority notice message that comes in here and any authpriv facility will write it to the system log. If you want to go totally bonkers and capture everything, you can use a wildcard in both cases and send it to your own log file, in this case, uber.log. I don't know, we want to grab everything. This is not a bad idea. It's something I do fairly regularly. One last thing to notice if you're actually going through this file that might grab your attention, you'll see these two lines. Install.asterisk goes to install.log. Fine, we understand that from the examples above. But immediately following it, you'll notice this line. Install.asterisk, that doesn't look like a log file. So there's two things that this should make you notice. One is that we can send logs to other places besides a log file on disk. The other thing that this should make you notice is that unlike a firewall rule where the first match wins and it stops, syslog will match every matching case in syslog.conf, so you can send messages to multiple log files and multiple destinations. This, we're going to get into this in a little bit, this terminology with sending to remote syslog, but for anyone who's wondering, this is something that Apple just never removed from the original BSD version of this file. There is nothing listening on your machine at port 32376. I mean, unless you went out of your way to set that up. But by default, that's not listening to anything. So now we have programs that are sending log messages to syslog and logging on their own, and syslog is filling up all of these log files. Awesome. But one day we're going to run out of space, right? So there needs to be a way to clean all this up. And there's a way to do that. It's called new syslog. Again, for anyone who's a Linux administrator, you're probably familiar with log rotate. This is just like log rotate, except it's more BSD. I don't know. That's why Apple does things, because they don't like GPL, and they won't include log rotate, so we get new syslog. And from the man page, new syslog will maintain system log files to manageable sizes. And that's exactly what it does. How does it do that, you ask? Another configuration file, etc newsyslog.conf. And again, here's a small snippet from the stock newsyslog.conf file on every Mac that's in here. And again, you break it down, it's pretty easy. The first column is the log file you want new syslog to watch. New syslog to watch. In this case, the first example, ftp.log, it's watching it. What it does, new syslog, is when it meets your rules for filling up, it rolls the log over by taking a copy of that file and truncating the active file. So that copy gets mode 640. So if you want to expand permissions or contract them a little bit, you can do that through the mode. That only applies to the copies that newsyslog.conf makes. It will keep 5 copies of these rolled logs, and it will eventually start deleting the oldest logs so your disks don't fill up entirely. This rule kicks in when FTP log hits 1,000 bytes. This column represents when new syslog should roll the logs. In this case, it's anytime that the log hits 1,000 bytes. You could restrict it to overnight hours, or you could restrict it to a particular day, but I think this is a wise default. Just leave it to run at any time. And the last column gives you some options on how to roll the logs over. In this case, the J represents bzip2 compression. So when it takes a copy of this log file, it will also compress it. And when newsyslog.conf runs, you'll notice this in your logs as the last line of the old log. New syslog, log file turned over due to size greater than 100K, right? Makes sense. It makes its own log entry and flips the log over. Again, I mentioned how it does this. If you go into your var log directory and look at some of your log files, you'll notice that there's the original active log file, in this case kernel.log, and then there are some additional entries. So again, how new syslog cleans these files up is it takes the current log file, it copies it, in our case compresses it, and creates kernel.log.0.bz2, and it truncates the active log file back to a 0-byte file. When that log file fills up, it comes along and steps them all down one. So the .0 version becomes .1, the current version becomes .0, and the current version again is truncated. In our case, I said we'll keep up to 5 copies. Once we're up to 5 copies, the oldest one rolls off the end, it just gets deleted. So again, you will eventually lose information here. As I mentioned, they are compressed. So if you try to look at those rolled over copies, you'll get a bunch of non-human readable gobbledygook. You could do something like this. Use cat and pipe it into b unzip2 and pipe it into tail. There happens to be a utility just for this, though, called bzcat, which will cat a file and unzip it on the fly. So that's sort of handy. I mentioned we would talk about remote syslog. And again, if you look in that etc services directory, you'll see that syslog is assigned UDP port 514. And your etc syslog.conf file will send messages or forward messages to a remote syslog server if it sees this designation, an @sign, a syslog server address that can be an IP address or that can be a name that's resolvable by DNS, and optionally a port. If you don't include the port, it's UDP port 514. If you include a port, it's UDP port whatever you've included. Any networking people here? Anyone deep into networking? No? Well, 1 or 2 hands. There's one question the networking people should be asking themselves right now, and that's UDP? UDP networking is otherwise known as unreliable networking. If a packet doesn't make it to its destination, no one knows about it, it falls off the end of the earth and goes into the bit bucket. So if you are doing a lot of remote syslog work on a local LAN, probably works great. If you are trying to do this over the internet, it's probably not a good idea. You will probably miss a lot of log messages. If you care a lot about log messages, unfortunately there's not a lot you can do about that. We do care about log messages, so we have a program that we're using that we wrote in-house, and we are looking to open source it, but it's a little bit of a mess. We're working pretty hard on rewriting it, but what it does is it has a configuration file. It watches the log files you tell it to watch. If there is a syslog server that it can reach, it forwards the log messages as normal. If it cannot reach a remote syslog server, it just queues up these messages in a local database, and once the server is available, it unspools them off to the central server. Yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing out there that I know of that does this. The other thing about syslog and its use of UDP is that nothing is protected. It's not SSL encrypted. So if you were sending log files over the internet or even on a local LAN, you might be passing some sensitive information. So that's something else to be aware of. Now, I keep saying syslog over and over again, syslog, 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 but somewhere around 10.4 in Tiger, I think it was, Apple actually snuck something in. They snuck in something called ASL. ASL is the Apple System Logger. And if you are coming from another Unix, what Apple has done is they call it syslog. But if you look at the man page for syslog, they let you in on the little secret that it's Apple System Logger. Apple System Logger is a drop-in replacement for syslog. So again, if you're coming from another Unix, you might not even notice the difference. There's still a syslog-d process that hangs around and listens for messages. However, ASL goes off and stores all of its messages in a local SQLite 3 database. And then it filters those messages through to regular syslog type messages. Just worth noting. I'm going to get into the syslog utility a little bit later on. Apache also gets a mention here. If you are an Apache administrator, you'll know that Apache does the direct write thing. And because it's a web server, you don't really want to bring it down to rotate logs around. So Apache has these two utilities. One's called rotate logs, which is a lot like new syslog. And what it will do is tell the Apache process to gracefully shut down and use a new log, and then it goes off and can roll the probably very large log if you're running a popular web server. The other utility that Apache provides you is called log resolve, which is actually kind of cool. So Apache accepts these incoming connections from remote machines. It logs their IP address. Sometimes you want to know what the fully qualified domain name of that IP address is. However, for Apache to resolve that name at runtime is a very expensive operation. So what people typically do is let Apache write the IP address to the log. Log resolve will come along and post-process that log for you and look up all those IP addresses and get their fully qualified domain name, if that's important to you. Apple does a number of things that keep me very convinced that they also feel that logs are important, right? So if you go through any of their troubleshooting documentation, for example, if you need to troubleshoot push notifications, Apple gives you these two commands. One is default write library preferences com.apple.apple push service d, apple push service write logs bool true, which turn on the logs. And there's a separate command that lets you set the log level, and the integer 7 is debug level logging. So Apple is very happy to collect good log information. For all of you Open Directory administrators, you've probably noticed this in Lion. ODUtil. ODUtil set log debug will turn on debug logging for Open Directory. Very important if you are troubleshooting Open Directory. Anyone used that before?
I've used the 10.6 version. So I think the
ODUtil.
nomenclature was a little different.
Oh yeah, you had to hop the directory service process with int1, user 1, and turn on debug level. This is much cooler in Lion, absolutely much cooler. But yeah, Apple has long provided ways to turn on very detailed logging. Some of this logging, like when you turn on ODUtil set log debug, I know I earlier said that logs are human readable. These things are not human readable. I am positive Apple has some program that processes these, because these logs, if you're on a busy network or big Open Directory infrastructure, these logs get just nuts. Even though they call it debug, I think this turns on what Apple used to call API level debugging, and it's just, you can use up your disk really fast with these logs. So, search, what do we want to know? How do I get to Carnegie Hall? Everyone knows the answer to that, right? On 3, practice, 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 right? There was an article earlier this year that I loved by Teller from Penn and Teller, and you should go read it, but I'll give you the money quote, and that's, "You will be fooled by a trick if it involves more time, money, and practice than you or any other sane onlooker would be willing to invest." And he goes on and gives some examples of that, and that's kind of what I want everyone here to go off and do. Personal story is that I'm a runner, and I like to run these crazy long distances. I've gotten addicted to running long distances. It started off as a way to improve my short running time, and then as you get up to doing these distances, you go, oh, 12 miles, I could do 13. Oh, 13, I could go do a half marathon. But if I want to do a half marathon, I need to be running 14 or 15 miles. And you just keep adding on the miles. And this inevitably comes up when I'm with my parents and they want to brag about their kid. They'll say, oh, Ed's running in a race this weekend, and my parents' friends say, oh, you run. How far do you run? I go, well, this morning I did 18 miles. I go, oh my gosh. To them, that looks like magic. How can someone do this? But they haven't been there with me waking up at times that they would consider insane. They haven't been there with me going out in weather that they would consider insane. And they haven't been there with me in temperatures, hot and cold, that they would consider insane. So it looks like magic. And I hope everyone here in this room has had that experience with technology, right? You, with a coworker or a family member, they come over and say, my computer's not printing. And you go, oh, here, just do this. And you just go over and, I don't know, you delete the printer and re-add it, and it starts printing. And they go, you're so smart. Well, sure, smartness has a bit to do with it, right? But they weren't there with you when you were up till 2 in the morning figuring this out. They weren't there with you when you were, again, up later solving something and learning something than any sane person would do. They weren't there with you when you were investigating every binary on the system to a degree that anyone else would consider probably insane. So I want you to perfect your craft, right? I love logs so much, I went off and wrote a screensaver that displays log files. I don't know. I want to stay in touch. And I think that's an important thing because the thing with logs is you have to get used to the pattern and the rhythm and the heartbeat of how these logs work and act. Musicians do this all the time. If you've ever been in a situation with a fire drill, you'll notice the fire alarm disappears after a while. I could leave this go for a very long time, and it'll eventually fade into the background. But as soon as there's a change, your ears perk up again, and you notice that something's changed. When there's another change, you'll notice it again. Some changes happen very slowly, and you don't pick up on them right away, or other changes are masked by other changes. A little drum fade out thing there, right? You didn't catch that. That's the magic there. But anyway, it's all about understanding the pattern and the rhythm, which means you have to be looking at logs all the time. And how do we do this? I mentioned some of them before. Some of the best utilities you can use are right here, and we're going to go through them. And if you still think you're not a terminal person, Apple provides Console app, which you can leave running all the time to get familiar with logs on your system. And very quickly, this button shows and hides the log list. There's this nice log list provided in Console app that shows you every log it knows about, so it's just a click away. There's a Move to Trash button, and this only works for logs that are in your user home directory. Anyone else have a bunch of these? Verizon Wireless D crash logs? Yeah, I get you. I'm there with you. You can trash them through Console app. And the last kind of cool thing is this button called Insert Marker. And all that does is insert a line, not in the log itself, but only on the display, so you can mark your position, and then when you later want to go back and look at this log, you can say, oh, what happened since I last marked this log? So, at the very least, leave Console app running like all the time, and as you're command tabbing through programs, stop and take a look at it every now and then. Yes?
Have they updated Geek Tool for Lion?
Yes, it's in the App Store. That's another good suggestion.
Because you can Geek Tool, which will throw anything on your desktop.
That's right. Does everyone know about Geek Tool? So Geek Tool is in the App Store now. And what it lets you do is display information on your desktop. And that can be a clock, it can be a web page, it can be just about anything. But one thing it does excel at are log files. I used to do that. However, I find I never see my desktop anymore. So it became less and less useful. But yes, I'm memorizing everyone in here, and I want to see you running Console app the rest of the conference. Deal? All right. Yes?
One of the nice little things about Console app is there's gzip.
Yeah, you're right. So the other nice thing about Console app is that if you click on a file that is gzipped or compressed, it will uncompress it on the fly for you. The other cool thing about that is the search box works across those compressed files too. So yeah, I used to kind of really be down on console app, but as it got better and better, I find myself using it more and more. That's cool. But anyway, command line utilities are really useful because as IT people, we often troubleshoot remote machines. And console app does not work across the network to a remote machine. So it's useful to use these command line utilities. Cat, I'm not really going to cover. Everyone knows what cat does, right? It just takes a file and spits it out to the console. gunzip and bzcat, again, useful for compressed log files that you want to find. Here's the example I gave earlier, bzcat, and I bzcat this compressed log file, and it'll display it on the console for me. And of course, you can pipe this into something like grep if you're looking for something specific.
What will bzcat do to an uncompressed file?
I have no idea. It might be smart enough just to not, just to cat it and not touch it. I don't know. Anyone with a free Mac want to try? I don't know. Tail. Tail is probably one of the more useful utilities. As an example, you can use tail with the F switch, which means follow, and it will display system log, the last few lines of system log, and then sit there and wait. It won't return your prompt to you, but as new lines get added to system log, it will display them on the screen for you. So that's really useful to open up a console, tail F a file, start doing things, and watch as the log fills up. And this is what that kind of looks like. Tail F, and it dumps out a bunch of lines, just so we know what we're looking at. Each one of these is a log record. And we can see, in my case, one password agent was kind of losing its mind and dropping a bunch of log files, log entries in the log file, because it couldn't, I don't know, socket did disconnect. I don't know, couldn't reach some remote server. The other thing tail is good at is grabbing a bunch of lines off the end of a file. So if you want to look at the last 400 lines of a file, you can just give the number you're looking for with a hyphen. So you pass that in as a flag. It shows you the last X number of lines that you specify. And of course, you probably want to pipe that into less so you can page up and down through it. What was that? Sorry.
I do exit tail. I've gotten myself in there and I...
Q? Yep. So it uses Vim-like commands. Oh, no, tail should just dump stuff out. If you've piped it to less, that will require you hitting Q. Oh, tail-F, Control-C will get out of it. There you go. Less and more. Actually, little trivia, on OS X, less is more. It's a symlink. Think about it. If you use less is a pager, and again, it's almost like Vim or a text editor, except you can't edit. It'll display the file, it'll let you page up and down through the file. If you hit capital F, F is for follow, and it will act like tail F. And it will wait, and then it will display new lines as they're added to a given log file. The other cool thing about less is you can use /, just like in Vim, to search through a log file. It will highlight the matches. But what's great about that is when you combine search and Shift F, as new lines get added, if there are any matches, it will highlight the matches, which just helps you pick up on those patterns a little bit easier. And finally, as I mentioned, Apple included their own logging utility, ASL, but they call it syslog, not to be confused with syslog-D, which is the server, which listens for messages. There's a binary on your system called syslog. I don't use the binary probably as much as I should, but what the syslog binary does is go through the SQLite3 database where all these log messages are stored. So you can ask syslog to show you the last 20 messages and then wait. -W is for wait, so that acts like tail F. The cool thing syslog does is really let you get specific. This is where I would probably use grep, but syslog has this built in where you can define a keyword and you can use multiple keywords to show you entries in syslog. So for example, if you run this all right now, user event agent is the thing that's responsible for when a wireless service has protection on it, and it does that little pop-up for you. So at this conference, we have the AT&T Wi-Fi thing. You will probably have tons of these log messages from user event agent in the last 2 hours if you are using the conference Wi-Fi. So that's just an example of how the syslog binary can be used to filter out messages. So now we have all these log messages running along. And again, it's really about learning the heartbeat of the system. There are lots of ways to visualize log files, right? Here's one called Logstalgia. It's a nostalgic way to look at your logs. It sets up a game of Pong. And Logstalgia, in this case, is going through a web server log. And it shows the connecting IP addresses. They send over the Pong ball as their request. And it either serves that up, or I thought this was really cool with Logstalgia, if it misses one, it shows a 404. Anyone know what that's about? That's a missed hit on a web server, is a 404. I'm not claiming that this is the absolute best way to look at your logs. However, it does get you in the rhythm. Like if you're watching this, the one thing that hasn't ever gone away is headlines XML. If I had this running all the time, and one day came in and didn't see headlines XML on this display, I would immediately know something was very wrong. So again, however you want to get into the rhythm of these log files, I think it's really important. There was a Linux-based program once that you could define keywords and it would watch a log, and every time it hit one of those keywords, it would make a sound. And the default was like this forest scene, which was awesome because info level messages would be crickets and leaves falling, but then errors would be thunder and things growling. So it makes you pay attention, right? So now we have all these log files piling up on disk and getting sent along remotely. Professor David Byrne had another question.
You may ask yourself, am I right? Am I wrong? And you may say to yourself, my God, what have I done?
Thank you, David. What have I done? We have tons of information now. How do we go through all of this information? Again, we have machines piling up their log messages, sending them to a central log server. How do you go through all this data? And it's not manually. Just wanted to talk briefly about some solutions that are out there. There's one solution, you've probably seen ads for it. They run ads all over the place, called Splunk. It is not a free application, although they do have a free license where if you don't use more than 500 megabytes, if you don't process more than 500 megabytes of logs a day, it's free. So that might apply to a lot of you. But anyway, what Splunk does is it gives you this great console. And in this case, I was just looking at my home network with Splunk, and I was only sending messages into Splunk via syslog. And it tells you the source, UDP 514. Splunk also acts as a drop-in replacement for a syslog server. And it tells you how many events it indexed. It tells you what hosts are hitting the server. Even though I was only using syslog, Splunk is incredibly complete in where it can pull log or log-like data in from, including running and collecting the output of a script. Very cool. Windows events logs, Windows registry, configuration file, OPSEC LIA, I don't even know what that is. Splunk does it, I don't know. Apache logs, IIS logs. So it grabs just about everything. And again, visually being able to look at your log files goes a long way. In this case, I was also hovering my cursor over this last green bar, and it tells me how many events were recorded for this specific host at this date, which is pretty cool. You can further drill down. Here's an example where we looked up, they have a built-in search in Splunk. They're very smart. They know probably more than anything, you're not concerned with the things that are successful. You're probably more concerned with the things that have failed. So they have this failure query, which looks for the word error and fail and warn, and it'll highlight it. So that's a great way to go through your logs and see what's going off the rails. They do this error search like this, error or failed or severe, source type access. Anyone know what this is all about? 404 or 500 or 503? Yeah, web server logs. I personally probably would be processing my log files separately. That's just me, but this one query goes off and figures out all the stuff that's going wrong for you. And again, there's this other settings page in Splunk that lets you add ways to input, custom fields. Very, very, very cool. It wouldn't be a talk by me if I didn't talk about some open source alternative. And there is a project called Graylog 2. Lets you create a user, and then look at that. Gives you a very similar sort of dashboard into your log data, showing you current messages, activity. If there were log messages coming in, it shows them in real time, how many messages per minute. You can do some analytics and see, again, activity of log files. There's a shell here where you can actually drill down into this a little bit more deeply. Gives you a list of all of your hosts that are reporting in. Very cool. Again, you can, of course, query your log data. Here I'm going to kind of emulate what Splunk was doing and look for error or warn. And of course, you can see we have all these errors and warnings, something about MD worker and iTunes, shocking. You can also drill down into a specific message and see what the message was, where it came from, the full message, date and time. Very cool. Graylog 2, however, is horrifically difficult to set up. I'll be the first person to say that. It's a total nightmare. There is another open source project called PartyLog. It's in the handout, the URL to it, and that is a pre-built ISO that you can just stuff into VMware or Parallels and use it. I would recommend running something like this on a virtual appliance anyway. The other thing you can do with a mountain of log data is go through it yourself. How do you go through it yourself? Well, you build something like Splunk or Graylog. You take the programming language of your choice, you add a web service, you add a database, you add a graphing library, done. Well, all right, maybe it's not that easy because I would have written my own by then. Things like Graylog exist, but in very rare circumstances, you might need to be doing your own logging. So sure, it's an option. One other option is hosting. I was shocked to find out about this. More and more companies are popping up that do cloud-based hosting. So here's something, again, in the handout, called Papertrail app. I didn't look at their pricing. I have no idea. They say it starts at $0. I don't know what that entails. But here's a cloud-based logging engine and that will aggregate all your logs, and very similar to Splunk or Graylog, let you run analytics and look at these files. Again, I mentioned that log files don't predict the future. They don't. However, with a little statistical analysis, you can look for trends and you can kind of predict the future. Anyone ever use R? It's one of my favorite things ever. One hand? Okay.
I support R. I don't
Okay.
use R.
R is awesome. R is a statistical programming language. Yes. So R came from a project called S, which was a statistical language. It's still around. You can buy it for like $3,000 or use R, up to you. R is open source. Some people call it GNU S because it's basically a free version of S. I use a product called R Studio, again in the handout. RStudio is awesome because it gives you this 4-pane window where you can put code and use it interactively, and if you do plots, they show up right in the RStudio window. It's really a great application. Just to let you realize how serious this is, a lot of people use R to analyze very large sets of data. And here was something I found as I was poking around. There was an applications of R in business competition, with the first prize being $10,000 and going down from there. So I thought that was pretty cool. R was developed in around 1993-ish and has only gotten better. If you are already a programmer, the only weird thing about R is that it's a statistical programming language developed by statisticians, not programmers. So if you're a programmer, you come to R and you go, what the heck, what is going on here? There's some weird stuff that you have to get used to, but it's pretty straightforward after you dive in. Again, as I mentioned earlier, with the running, I love data. After all of these races, they always publish all the data about how fast and what ages and male or female, or about all of the runners, which is awesome. And you just go download it and you can run statistical analysis on it. And the important point here is that you need to use, again, as an IT person, you really need to use data to validate your assumptions. And I'm showing this because all of these races I have ever gone to, I look around and I go, oh my God, everyone's so young. Like the age here is probably like 15 or 20 is the average age. Well, you know what? Sure enough, once I get the data, the 40 to 50 age bracket every single time has the most runners. So if you would have asked me after a race just to guess at the average age, I would have been way off. But the data says otherwise. And you need to do the same thing with your systems. You can make an educated guess, but at some point, you need the data to back up what you're trying to do and trying to accomplish. So R is great. It lets you chop up things in a bunch of different ways. However, sometimes I like to pre-process data. So here's an example. I used system log, and I want to look at all of the messages. So I'm going to use this sed expression to chop out everything but the message. So now I have this file, system_message.log, with no timestamps, no host information, no process information, just the message. And I read it into R using the scan function, pretty straightforward. This variable x receives the contents of system message log, and I'm telling it that it's separated by a carriage return, just like all log files. And even without all the graphics, very easily you can ask for a summary. And when you look at this summary, you immediately notice a few things. The number one log entry with 47 entries is Sierra Software something, something, something. So again, this is my 3G card just going nuts or reporting a bunch of things. Actually, does anyone know? Since this is a 3G card, what the 3 pluses probably means? Oh, come on. We have some old timers in here, no? Yeah, AT modem commands. We're still using them. Crazy, right? The next thing you might notice, though, is this second entry is summarized 30 times, and the one following it is summarized 27 times. But wait a minute. Socket did disconnect, error domain. They look like the same message. Why are they broken into 2 different messages? Well, statistical software is very picky, and each time these messages are reported, they have different user info. So I'm going to tell you how to overcome that in a second. But but as a human, you can kind of look at that and go, all right, there's 57 entries of this. It's probably something to go take a look at. And you'll notice the same thing here. Very, very minute detail here. But this one's CGS set window transform at placement. And this one's CGS set window transforms at placement. 2 different log messages. Crazy. And then at the end of this summary, it will tell you, oh, outside of the top 5, there's these 1498 other log entries. So if you are pathological like me and want to clean all this data, or anytime you deal with data, you usually need to clean it up a little bit, There's an open source program, Google Refine. Downloadable, very cool. I'll go over it really fast. You tell it to read in your log file, and then it shows you all the unique entries in your log. There were 4 of these, and there were 2 of these. But you can hit this cluster button, and what it does is it goes through the log entries, and it says, you know, these all look like they're close enough to be the same. Should I merge them? You click on the merge button, and you say merge selected and recluster until you have all unique entries. And what that does is it lets you write out a new copy of this log where it only has one version of these log files. Same count of them, but they're all the same version. So I'm going to do the same trick as before, use this merged log file and a sed statement, and instead this time of chopping out the message, I'm only interested in the timestamp, very specifically the hour that these log messages came in. And I read that into R, and I run a histogram. And it shows me this. Now, this isn't a very big sample, right? This was one log file, but it shows me at, you know, this is midnight, and this is 8, 9. So at 10 p.m., I have the most log entries show up. Why is that? Well, I don't know. I didn't really do the analysis. But as I mentioned, while log files don't exactly predict the future, you can use trends. If I'm analyzing my logs every day, and I notice that every Thursday, every machine in my fleet reports more errors, I can be pretty sure that this Thursday, every machine in my fleet is going to report more errors, right? Maybe that's something I need to look at. Maybe it's totally benign. You don't know until you dig in. But again, it's getting used to the rhythm of your logs and the patterns they follow. And when they break that pattern, that's the time that you really need to kind of pay attention and figure out what's going on. So I hope that answered what you were doing here. I hope it answered some of your questions and fears. If anyone has any last questions, I can answer for you. Yeah.
There are a couple of things that I know I want to see logs on, but I have not been able to suss out what log to look in. For example, like how many AFP users I have connected, or like what, or last. Those are two that.
So again, sometimes logs are the right answer. Sometimes they're not. Or sometimes you need to go off and create your own log. So like AFP users, you might want to set up a recurring job that runs on your server that uses server admin to go query that and then write that out to a log file. Right. So now you have some history and you have some context and you have some things that you have a log file that you can query right there. Right? I mean, that could be useful. I'm assuming that's how Apple's tools do it with the graph and everything.
No, but there's no like sort of database and website saying what log does what.
Yeah, there probably isn't. Sometimes you have to poke around. Sometimes it's useful just to use grep. There is an Apple Talk log. I forget where it is. I haven't had to use it in a very long time, but there is an Apple Talk log. I think last time I looked at it, it was very bare bones, which is why it might not be useful. Like it just gives you the IP address and if they connected.
The only other question I have is that I've just been playing with it is, and we looked at that config file, is last doesn't actually write a log file. I think it passes it through Apple logger.
Last or less or?
Last. If you type last into a terminal, thing.
Oh, right.
Log in.
Right. No, that gets it from WTemp. That gets it from var WTemp.
Yeah, I looked in var WTemp and there's nothing there.
It did last I looked. Anyone have information on that? Where last or who gets its information from? Maybe they changed it, but it was definitely WTemp at one point. Maybe they moved it to like var run WTemp. I don't know. Sure. But if that utility is getting its information from somewhere, it's there, right?
Right. Yeah.
Apple has a KBase article on like how to find logged in users.
You can also use FS events and just look and see like.
Yep.
Connect with AFP, see what files get modified.
Yep. That's true. FS events or instruments or something like that will tell you everything that a program opens up. Yes.
So what is your strategy for when you're dealing with a log that it's coming so quickly, you know, like a few entries every second. Like, you know,
Yeah, you post-process it, right? So you grab it offline or you throw it into something like tail or less, and you just step through it.
I mean, even though it'll be a few minutes behind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least, again, that's why it's important for your machines to have good, accurate time information so you can correlate those things. It depends. Maybe there's a way to, so if you run something, right, and you're tailing the log file and it's just spitting out tons of information, you scroll back a little bit, maybe look for some keywords, and you can do grep on the fly, right? You could do, follow it and pipe it through grep to filter down how much information you're seeing. That might be a useful strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, for me, for log files to be useful, because I don't have your love for minutia to just look at it for hours. I'm in charge of SNMP monitoring. So if you have really, really good SNMP monitoring in place, it will detect a failure of a service or process or hardware.
Sure.
And that will give you a timestamp to then go through fishing through your log files to get more detailed information.
Yeah.
And you were talking about Splunk. They offer free-day seminars every once in a while.
Oh, okay.
And there's one on the 15th in DC that just happened to have got an invite like last week for.
Good to know. Yeah, Splunk, they make an excellent product, no question about it, but they're pretty aggressive with the marketing, and which is good,
Yeah, well, there's a free, like I said, up to 500 megabytes a day. You can just play around with it.
Yep.
If it does what you need. And to his point, when you're looking at something that happens over a network transaction, what I found to be a really good tool to generate data to mine is Wireshark.
Oh, absolutely.
You know the process you look for, you get Wireshark running, and you get a capture filter on the message of the transaction you're looking for, and it will just pick
Sure.
that up from your network and write that to a file. And
Like I said, logs are just a piece of this puzzle, and maybe you should be using something like IOStat or Wireshark or doing packet captures, and depending on what the problem is. Let me just get one in the back. Yeah.
Sure.
I generally look at the system logs to see how the machines are, and sometimes it can take like half a day. So are there key logs to hit for like the heartbeat of the machine? There's places to go to see, okay, it's being attacked by somebody across the globe.
Well, system log, definitely. Secure log in your case. Var log, secure log. Again, if you want to see them both at once, you can use syslog.conf, route them both into the same file, and look at them at the same time. Or again, any of these utilities that give you a visual indication of what's going on, really handy. Graylog or Splunk, and be looking for things like error. And it'll show you errors or warnings across all the log files it's collecting.
Error or fail.
Or fail, right.
Well, I don't know if Graylog does it, but Splunk allows you to set up alerts. So you don't,
Yes.
because the whole point is you don't want to look at these things. You want to get notified when something's out of whack. So, you don't want to go over the log files, but if you know that when you're being attacked, you're going to get this message, and you want to parse all your log files to a central server,
Right.
it's going to send you an email telling you the iMac in Lab 6 is getting attacked from China.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always China. Anybody else?
What about, is there any logging to be found in like EFI? So you're troubleshooting in a pre-moved environment.
Not that I know of. That's always a pretty limited environment. I don't know. Anybody know anything about that I don't? Logging in the EFI environment?
Well, you don't have to
Sort out the drive, where's it gonna log in?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Nothing that I know of. There are things that Apple has set up where you can do logging and debugging over USB.
Right.
So FE might have some capability there. I don't know offhand, but I know, I hate to say this, but what was the name of it? There's a utility called FWKPD. It was a FireWire debugger, but I pronounce it fwooked up, which is like, that's the time that you really need it, when the machine is totally fwooked up, right? So there are these utilities that let you debug a machine that looks otherwise catatonic.
Right.
So some of them, again, go over a serial port like USB.
Right.
So I'm sure, at Apple, right, or if you load the debugger, the developer tools, there is a There's a Bluetooth debugger, there's a USB debugger. So someone at Apple probably has something that lets them debug the FE environment. Whether we do or not, I don't know. Last questions? No? Awesome. Thank you very much.